this day in 1922, cinemas were showing one of the early films of a great royal occasion. This was the wedding of Princess Mary to Viscount Lascelles. Since then, the screen has made these scenes in London familiar to millions of people all over the world. The decorated procession route, the mass crowds, the troops and guards and military bands in all the pageantry of full dress, the elegant coaches, the brilliant assembly of royalty and of great statesmen and famous personalities. For a moment, the great crowd saw the Princess Royal as she handed her bouquet to be laid by the cenotaph. The procession turns from Whitehall into the Mall. And then the now familiar scenes in front of Buckingham Palace. Thousands of people rushing to vantage points to wait for the royal couple to come out on the balcony. In 1947, Holland was celebrating a royal occasion, the birth of a princess. Prince Bernhard is carrying the fourth daughter born to him and his wife Queen Juliana, and shows her in accordance with Dutch law to the Prime Minister. The prince and the ministers drink the health of the baby, Princess Maria Christina, and she's given the ration cards and clothing coupons still necessary at that time for every Dutch citizen. The new sister is shown to the other three princesses. In 3 generations, there's been no male heir to the throne of Holland. Sonja Henie became world famous in 1927. Just before this day, she'd won the Ladies' World Championship for amateur figure skating in Oslo, and in the following year she held her title at the championships in London. Her skating costume showed the influence of the times, but there's nothing dated about the 17-year-old Norwegian girl's brilliant technique. Her home country of Norway made grim news in the war. But on the Lofoten Islands in 1941, the British achieved one small triumph in a black year. On this day, March the 4th, the commandos made their first big raid on these islands just off Narvik, scene of a glorious and bitter defeat. Before the smoke of Dunkirk had blown away, the commandos, hand-picked volunteers, were ready to go into offensive action. Lofoten was the first real success. 220 German prisoners taken, 18,000 tons of enemy shipping sunk. ...314 Norwegian volunteers taken off the island to join in the fight for freedom. Nazi-operated factories and petrol storage tanks blown up. perhaps, than a pinprick to the vast German defences, but the commando raids kept the Germans guessing along the hundreds of miles of coastline from Narvik to Saint-Nazaire. And it was in these raids that our men learned how to employ the tactics and to manoeuvre the landing craft for the final assault on the enemy coast. The British were on their way back. From Egypt in 1954, the British were on their way out. For a brief spell, General Naguib was in power again. Since the army in 1952 had driven King Farouk from the throne and established General Naguib as president, he'd been in precarious control of his powerful army backers. Only 3 days before these scenes, members of the Revolutionary Council headed by Colonel Nasser had forced him to resign. Colonel Nasser was made Prime Minister, but was forced to acknowledge Naguib once again as president by officers of the cavalry regiments. It was a popular return to power. General Naguib was the only high-ranking officer among the revolutionaries, and the only man the people knew as a personality and respected as a leader. In him, they placed the hopes they had once had of the man who was the young and handsome heir to the Egyptian throne, when the British were still a power in the land. In Cairo in 1934, the RAF gave a display of strength that must have been galling to young Prince Farouk. No sign yet of the gross figure he was to become. He not only made an enemy of the British, whose power he attacked partly to cover up the failure of his own monstrous regime, but also antagonized his own people, who watched the young prince become a grotesque symbol of luxurious living and perhaps the last of the Egyptian kings. Flying over Africa 8 years earlier was an escort of planes welcoming Alan Cobham on his flight from London to the Cape, calling at Paris, Athens, Karnak, Atbara, Pretoria, Cape Town. It sounds like a routine flight from London Airport. And it is the routine overseas flights of today that one or two men like Cobham, with very little money but with a vast vision of the heavens filled with commerce, made possible. Sir Alan showed that long-distance flying across the world could become what he himself called quite ordinary procedure. The main interest of this transatlantic flight in the same year is the pilot, the young Commander Franco. There he is with a roll of paper in one hand, the man who, as General Franco, shattered Europe with the first full-scale modern bombing attacks. On this day in 1937, Barcelona was mourning her dead. Now, there's a terrible familiarity about this scene for most of us. But at the time of the Spanish Civil War, the world could weep for the first people to know the terror of the new weapons of death and destruction. What most people didn't realize was that they were also watching a ghastly dress rehearsal of the shape of things to come. Rehearsal in the Maginot Line was intended for just that purpose, but things didn't shape the expected way. The troops manning this great line of fortifications were well looked after. There were plenty of supplies, both of ammunition and good French food. But when war came, it bypassed the line, and these men had the weary, lifeless job of those who only stand and wait, until when at last they did see the enemy, he was the wrong side of them. Writing years later, Sir Winston Churchill described the Maginot Line as a wise precaution that was not properly used. And he said that the line not only absorbed very large numbers of highly trained regular soldiers and technicians, but exercised an enervating effect both upon military strategy and national vigilance. There were two funerals of famous men at this time of the year. In 1928, Marshal Diaz, Commander-in-Chief of the Italian armies of the First World War, was given a state funeral in Rome. After the disaster of Caporetto in 1917, when the Italians fled before the Austrian advance, Diaz reformed the battlefront, reorganized the Italian army, and saved the honor of his country. But the main interest of these pictures a quarter of a century later is in two of the mourners, King Victor Emmanuel and the man who was already his master, Benito Mussolini. The other death that was mourned at this time was in Scotland in 1950. Sir Harry Lauder had been seriously ill for months. It was exactly half a century since he'd come to London to make his name and his fortune. He began life as a miner, and all through his life he wrote and composed his own simple songs for the people. I love a lassie, stop your tickling, Jock, just a wee Dochen Doris. The sun has gone to rest. It's the time that I love best. My, it's lovely, roaming in the gloaming. Another great man of the people was Ernest Bevin, who left in March 1947 for a foreign ministers' conference in Moscow. But none of the major problems of the Cold War were settled in these discussions between the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain. In fact, the situation had deteriorated by this time in 1949, when Prime Minister Attlee went to give Britain's thanks to the men who carried out the Berlin airlift. In an operation that was grimly reminiscent of the war, the people of West Berlin were kept going in spite of the Russian blockade of the roads and railways.